Episode K, the Mountain Meadows Massacre. In this episode, we will be looking at the Mountain Meadows Massacre and the true events that unfolded. I will present both the church's claims and historical sources outside the church itself, presenting a different story. Let's take a look at what led up to the Mountain Meadows Massacre. The Mormon War. The massacre unfolded against a backdrop of escalating tensions between Mormon leader Brigham Young and the federal government. When the Mormons first settled in the Salt Lake area in 1847, it was Mexican territory. However, following the Mexican-American War, the U.S. swiftly claimed the land. The Compromise of 1850 designated Utah as a U.S. territory, and Brigham Young was appointed its first territorial governor. Despite his reappointment in 1854, conflict soon arose between Young's theocratic administration and the federal officials dispatched to the territory. These officials accused Young of intimidation and the destruction of government documents. In response, President James Buchanan deemed it necessary to use force to assert federal authority in Utah. In the spring of 1857, Buchanan declared the territory in rebellion, and a military force comprising 20% of the entire American army began its march westward that summer. To the Mormons, this looming military presence was reminiscent of past extermination orders and state-sanctioned violence towards them. In August, Brigham Young responded with defiant rhetoric, declaring his intention to resist not only the federal government, but all hell. This set the stage for a dramatic and violent confrontation as the Mormons prepared for what they perceived as an existential threat. One major issue was that Brigham Young imposed his will through his followers, blurring the lines between civil governance and religious authority. He conflated the laws of the land with the laws of the church, enforcing them according to his personal interpretation and directive. Young devised a calculated strategy for the coming conflict. Rather than engage the federal army head-on, he aimed to cripple its supply lines. Demonstrating his control over the region, he shut down the immigrant trails passing through Utah en route to California. To enforce this, he forbade Mormons from selling supplies to travelers and unleashed previously restrained Indian tribes to harass wagon trains, specifically encouraging them to seize the cattle. While it's uncertain whether Young directly ordered attacks on individual migrant groups, evidence indicates that in August he authorized local tribes to have at the wagon trains. Additionally, Young's incendiary rhetoric likely incited local Mormons to escalate from hostility to outright violence. Others state Young directly ordered these attacks, which we will look at shortly. The Fancher Party. The Baker-Fancher Party, also known as the Fancher Party or Baker's Company, was a group of American immigrants from Marion, Crawford, Carroll, and Johnson counties in Arkansas. These prosperous farmers and cattlemen, well equipped with financial resources, set out from Carroll County in April 1857, aiming to reach California. The group, composed of several smaller parties, initially departed separately from the Ozarks in northwestern Arkansas, but they joined forces along the way. Key factions included the Baker Train, led by Captain John Twitty Baker from Carroll County, and the Fancher Train, headed by the experienced Alexander Fancher from Benton County. Other contingents such as the Huff, Mitchell, Dunlap, Prewitt, Poteet, Tackett, Jones, Cameron, and Miller trains also merged with the main body. Among them was Pleasant Tackett, a Methodist minister from the Poteet, Tackett, Jones train, who conducted worship and prayer services during their journey. The party was well outfitted with wagons, carriages, over 1,000 head of cattle, oxen, and numerous horses. They were driven westward by various motivations. Some aimed to settle in California, others to drive cattle for profit, and some to seek their fortune in California's gold fields. As was customary for emigrants, they carried significant funds and planned to restock supplies in Salt Lake City. Historian Juanita Brooks suggests their arrival in Salt Lake City occurred around August 3rd or 4th, 1857. By this time, their supplies were dwindling, though they still managed to bring over 800 head of cattle to Utah, a critical resupply point on their journey. Along the plains, some members of the original party split off to pursue other destinations, avoiding the grim fate that awaited the Arkansans in Utah. Notably, any Missourians who may have initially traveled with the group seem to have safely reached other destinations, distancing themselves from the tragedy that befell the Baker-Fancher party. The Baker-Fancher party, denied supplies in Salt Lake City, decided to push forward along the Old Spanish Trail through southern Utah. In August 1857, as tensions simmered, Mormon apostle George A. Smith toured the Southern Territory, urging settlers to stockpile grain, a clear signal of the brewing conflict. On his return journey to Salt Lake City, Smith crossed paths with the Baker-Fancher party at Corn Creek on August 25, 1857. After traveling 165 miles south from Salt Lake City, the emigrants received a suggestion from Jacob Hamblin to continue on the trail and rest their cattle at Mountain Meadows, a location known for its rich pastures near Hamblin's homestead. This seemingly innocuous advice would soon lead the party to a tragic fate. Before I proceed, I need to introduce someone who will be key in this event. John D. Lee, a member of the Danites, a vigilante group formed during the Mormon War in Missouri, also served as an official scribe for the Council of 50, advising the church on its westward migration. After Joseph Smith's death, Lee followed Brigham Young to Utah, where he helped establish several communities, including Lee's Ferry and Lonely Dell Ranch near present-day Page, Arizona. A successful farmer and rancher, Lee became a U.S. Indian agent in 1856, assisting Native Americans in Iron County, Utah. He later served in the Utah Territorial Legislature and, in 1872, founded the Lee's Ferry crossing on the Colorado River. The attack, a rumor circulated that the Baker-Fancher party included individuals responsible for the 1838 Haun's Mill Massacre, fueling intense anger and escalating tensions among the local LDS members. This false accusation painted the immigrants as enemies, stirring the settlers to view them with hostility. However, there is no evidence to support the claim that anyone from Missouri, let alone participants in the Haun's Mill Massacre, was among the wagon train during the attacks. Parley Pratt, a revered Mormon missionary, had recently been murdered in the emigrants' home state, inflaming local Mormon resentment. As the Baker-Fancher party passed through Cedar City, rumors of their supposed insults spread rapidly, igniting a volatile situation. Fueled by anger and the tense atmosphere of impending conflict, the local Mormon militia, allied with Paiute Indians, decided to strike. Brigham Young was informed that the Baker-Fancher party was from Arkansas. Rumors, detailed in the Argus letters published in the Corinne Daily Reporter, suggested that Eleanor McLean Pratt, one of Parley Pratt's plural wives, had identified a member of the party as connected to her husband's murder. However, conflicting accounts indicate that Eleanor Pratt was not actually present at the murder. The Baker-Fancher party left Corn Creek and continued the 125-mile journey to Mountain Meadows, passing through the southern Utah towns of Parowan and Cedar City, led by stake presidents William H. Dame and Isaac C. Haight. Both men were also senior military leaders of the Nauvoo Legion, the Mormon militia. As the emigrants neared, local LDS leaders convened multiple meetings in Cedar City and Parowan to discuss how to enforce Young's recent declaration of martial law. While most witnesses described the Fancher party as peaceful and well-behaved, rumors of their alleged misdeeds quickly spread. U.S. Army Brevet Major James Henry Carleton, who led the first federal investigation into the massacre in 1859, documented these accusations, including a claim that the Fanchers had poisoned a spring near Corn Creek. According to Hamblin's account, this poisoning supposedly led to the deaths of 18 cattle and several people who consumed the tainted meat. Carleton interviewed the father of a child who allegedly died from the poisoned water and acknowledged the father's grief. Yet he also included testimony from an investigator who doubted that the Fancher party had the means to poison the spring, given the group's size. Carleton encouraged readers to consider the broader context of these accusations, highlighting the pervasive distrust Mormons held toward outsiders and the envy some locals felt toward the Fancher party's wealth. These factors likely fueled the rumors that cast a shadow over the emigrants, contributing to the tragic events that followed. On Sunday, September 6, 1857, during a stake high council meeting after church services, Haight raised the question of how to deal with the emigrants. The idea of orchestrating a Native American-led massacre was considered, though not all council members supported this approach. The council ultimately decided to delay any action until Haight could seek Brigham Young's guidance. The following day, James Haslam was dispatched on a 6-day round-trip horseback journey to Salt Lake City to deliver the urgent request for advice. However, after the council meeting, Haight sent a messenger south to John D. Lee. While what Haight communicated to Lee remains unclear, the timing suggests it may have been related to the council's discussions about waiting for Young's instructions. At dawn on September 7, 1857, a brutal assault was launched against the Fancher party, encamped in the tranquil alpine valley of Mountain Meadows. The timing of the attack suggests a premeditated decision by the local council, which had convened just the day before, on Sunday, September 6th. This rapid sequence of events raises the question, did Brigham Young issue orders before John D. Lee's involvement? The immediate transition from deliberation to execution implies that the decision to attack was likely predetermined, possibly influenced by prior instructions from Young. We'll come back to Lee and Young shortly. The Baker-Fancher party was brutally attacked by Nauvoo Legion militiamen disguised as Native Americans, supported by some Paiute Indians. The emigrants fought back fiercely, creating a defensive perimeter by chaining their wagons together, digging shallow trenches, and fortifying their position with dirt. Despite their efforts, 7 emigrants were killed in the initial assault and buried within their defensive ring, while 16 others were wounded. The siege dragged on for 5 days, during which the trapped families suffered severe shortages of fresh water and food, and their ammunition dwindled. As the attack continued, local Mormon leadership reportedly struggled with disorganization. Even more worrisome, the emigrants had seen that Mormons were involved in the assault, and this would undercut any later claims that the attack had been solely the work of Indians. Lee and his followers decided to kill anyone old enough to testify, and then they set a trap. Lee's men offered the surrounded settlers safe passage out. Then when the Arkansans agreed, the Mormons slaughtered every man, woman, and child over the age of 7, some 120 in all. The militiamen then took a vow of silence, and the cover-up began. The assault would be blamed entirely on the Paiutes, and the truth would be concealed throughout the church hierarchy. Brigham Young himself would play a part. Nancy Huff, one of the 17 survivors and just over 4 years old during the massacre, recalled in 1875 that an 18th survivor, a girl about 10 or 12 years old, was killed because she was deemed too old to be left alive. This left 17 children, who were subsequently taken in by local Mormon families. The treatment of these children while in Mormon custody is troubling. When Captain James Lynch reported in May 1859, he described the survivors as in a most wretched condition, half-starved, half-naked, filthy, infested with vermin, and their eyes diseased from the neglect they had suffered. His July affidavit further noted that when the children were first seen by rescuers, they were covered with filth and dirt, and had little or no clothing. Leonard J. Arrington, founder of the Mormon History Association, notes that Brigham Young received James Haslam's report on the same day as the massacre. Upon learning of the militia's intentions, Young sent a letter instructing that the Baker-Fancher party should be left in peace. However, this letter arrived 2 days too late, on September 13, 1857. Young's message of reply to Haight, dated September 10, 1857, read, "In regard to emigration trains passing through our settlements, we must not interfere with them until they are first notified to keep away. You must not meddle with them. The Indians we expect will do as they please, but you should try and preserve good feelings with them. There are no other trains going south that I know of. If those who are there will leave, let them go in peace." There's a critical discrepancy in the timeline that needs addressing. James Haslam was dispatched on a 6-day round trip to Salt Lake City, right after the High Council meeting on September 6th. Given that the massacre occurred the following day, September 7th, and according to the Mormon History Association, Brigham Young received the news on the same day as the attack, we're effectively cutting 2 days from the timeline. This raises a crucial question. Was the High Council meeting held earlier than reported? Given that Young was informed of the proposed attack on the very day it occurred, why did it take him 3 days to respond? This delay is perplexing and raises serious questions about the timing and effectiveness of his response. Young claimed he first learned of the massacre from John D. Lee, a direct participant, when Lee briefed him in Salt Lake City on September 29, 1857, just days after the event. However, in 1875, Young incorrectly testified that the meeting took place some 2 or 3 months after the massacre. Decades later, Young's son, who was 13 at the time, recalled being in the room and hearing Lee blame the massacre on Native Americans. Yet, according to Lee, he informed Young that Mormons were responsible, though Young testified that he cut Lee off, unable to bear hearing the gruesome details. After the massacre, some of the deceased's property was reportedly seized by the Native Americans involved, but a substantial amount of cattle and personal belongings was confiscated by Mormons in southern Utah. John D. Lee, who assumed control over the collected livestock and other assets at the Mormon settlement in Pinto, oversaw their distribution. Some of the cattle were sent to Salt Lake City and traded for boots, while a portion remained under Lee's control. The remaining personal property of the Baker-Fancher party was taken to Cedar City's tithing house and auctioned off to local Mormons. Jacob Hamblin later claimed that Lee gave him a detailed account of the massacre, clearly implicating Mormon involvement. Hamblin reported this to Young and George A. Smith soon after, only to be told to keep quiet with the assurance, "As soon as we can get a court of justice, we will ferret this thing out." In 1858, when Young reported the massacre to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, he falsely attributed the atrocity solely to Native Americans. Brigham Young, appalled at what had taken place, initially ordered an investigation into the massacre, but in the end, it must be acknowledged that his own unwillingness to work with federal authorities contributed both directly and indirectly to the blunder of justice, and was part of the reason 2 trials were necessary. In the 1870s, indictments were issued for John D. Lee, William H. Dame, Philip Klingensmith, Elliott Wilden, and George Adair Jr., who were arrested. Warrants were also sought for the arrest of 4 others, Isaac C. Haight, John Higbee, William C. Stewart, and Samuel Jukes, who had managed to evade capture. Klingensmith avoided prosecution by agreeing to testify against the others. In 1870, Brigham Young excommunicated several of the accused, including Haight and Lee, from the LDS Church. The U.S. government posted $500 bounties for the capture of Haight, Higbee, and Stewart, while prosecutors decided not to pursue charges against Dame, Wilden, and Adair. At his sentencing, Lee was given the choice of execution methods per Utah Territory law, hanging, shooting, or beheading, and opted to be shot. He was executed by firing squad at Mountain Meadows on March 23, 1877. Young considered Lee's punishment justified but insufficient for the gravity of the crime, believing it did not absolve Lee sufficiently for entrance into the celestial kingdom. Before his execution, Lee claimed he was a scapegoat, alleging that others involved in the massacre had escaped justice. Lee stated before his death, "I have always believed, since that day, that General George A. Smith was then visiting southern Utah to prepare the people for the work of exterminating Captain Fancher's train of emigrants, and I now believe that he was sent for that purpose by the direct command of Brigham Young." The knowledge of how George A. Smith felt towards the emigrants, and his telling me that he had a long talk with Haight on the subject, made me certain that it was the wish of the church authorities that Fancher and his train should be wiped out. And knowing all this, I did not doubt then, and I do not doubt it now either, that Haight was acting by full authority from the church leaders, and that the orders he gave to me were just the orders that he had been directed to give when he ordered me to raise the Indians and have them attack the emigrants. The Mormon War ended swiftly. By June 1858, U.S. soldiers marched unopposed through Salt Lake City. Brigham Young accepted a new governor for Utah, and President Buchanan pardoned the Mormons for their rebellion. However, the stain of the Mountain Meadows Massacre proved far more enduring. John D. Lee remained a fugitive until November 1874 and faced trial for murder the following year. The trial ended in a hung jury, but Young struck a deal with the U.S. attorney. In exchange for evidence that would confirm Lee's guilt, the prosecutor agreed not to pursue charges against other Mormons or implicate the church hierarchy. Lee felt betrayed, but Young declared, "The time has come when they will try John D. Lee and not the Mormon Church." and that is all we have ever wanted. Historians generally agree that Brigham Young played a role, albeit perhaps unwittingly, in provoking the Mountain Meadows Massacre and subsequently in concealing its aftermath. The central debate revolves around whether Young had prior knowledge of the massacre's planning and whether he initially endorsed it before publicly condemning the act. Young's inflammatory rhetoric and violent language in response to the federal expedition undoubtedly contributed to the charged atmosphere leading up to the attack. In the wake of the massacre, Young publicly proclaimed that God had exacted divine retribution on the Baker-Fancher party. It remains ambiguous whether Young's statement stemmed from a belief that the emigrants posed a genuine threat to Mormon settlers or from a perception that they were responsible for previous wrongs against the Mormons. Historian William P. McKinnon asserts, after the Utah War, U.S. that President James Buchanan suggested that direct communication with Brigham Young might have prevented the conflict, while Young claimed that a north-south telegraph line in Utah could have averted the Mountain Meadows Massacre. McKinnon further argues that the hostilities might have been avoided if Young had prioritized a trip to Washington, D.C. to address the escalating governmental issues rather than embarking on a 5-week northern journey for church-related purposes just before the Utah War. The first monument dedicated to the victims was erected 2 years after the massacre by Major Carleton and the U.S. Army. This initial memorial was a modest cairn built over the graves of 34 victims, topped with a large cedar cross. However, the monument was destroyed, with some reports suggesting it was demolished as early as 1861 during Brigham Young's visit to Mountain Meadows. According to Wilford Woodruff, who would later become president of the church, Young reacted to the inscription on the cross, which read, "Vengeance is mine, thus saith the Lord. I shall repay by saying, it should be vengeance is mine, and I have taken a little." The structure was replaced by the U.S. Army in 1864. In 1932, local residents built a memorial wall around the remnants of the original monument. In 1998, Gordon B. Hinckley, president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, visited Mountain Meadows and was deeply troubled by the neglected state of the monument at the site. Recognizing the need for a more fitting tribute, he vowed to the church that a proper memorial would be constructed. "We owe the dead respect," Hinckley asserted, "that land is sacred ground." On September 11, 1999, a new monument was unveiled at Mountain Meadows. Standing in the afternoon sunlight, President Hinckley addressed the gathered crowd, stating, "The past cannot be recalled. It cannot be changed. It is time to leave the entire matter in the hands of God." Prologue: The Paiute Band provides an account that closely aligns with the Baker-Fancher survivors' version of events. According to their narrative, they were initially led under false pretenses. When the Paiute chief and his warriors learned of the true nature of the plans, the chief called off his men and withdrew. The attack by the LDS forces continued after the Paiute's departure. The Paiute were alarmed to see several LDS members dressed in Native American attire, with faces painted for war, rather than in European clothing, which heightened their concerns. Histories and legends from the surviving children of the massacre, who were as young as 6 at the time, have been passed down through generations and offer a slightly different perspective on the events. In 2007, to mark the 150th anniversary of the massacre, the descendants of these survivors gathered in Utah to share their family histories. The accounts they presented were strikingly similar. All the families concurred that their stories described Mormons disguised as Native Americans, and none of the Native people were involved in the actual massacre. Some family accounts even included a bizarre element, describing how the Indians later washed off their disguises to reveal themselves as white. In conclusion, the Mountain Meadows Massacre remains one of the most controversial and tragic events in American history. While the official narratives and church accounts have evolved, a complex interplay of religious fervor, political tensions, and social hostilities contributed to the massacre. Despite the various investigations and memorials over the years, the true extent of the involvement of church leaders, including Brigham Young, continues to spark debate. Thank you so kindly for watching. This is the Ex-Mormon Informant signing off for today.